Hey, happy Wednesday, everybody. It is Wednesday, it is quarantine story time, and we are back here to continue working on War and Peace with our man Leo Tolstoy. Exciting news today, folks. We are going to be reading Volume 1, Part 3, Sections 17, 18, and 19, which should take us to the end of Volume 1. Woohoo! Which still puts us not even a quarter of the way through, but close to a quarter of the way through. So we have that to look forward to. Who's excited? I'm excited. I'm excited for us, for the making of progress through this book. Yesterday, we started the battle between the three emperors, the Austrian-Russian emperor fighting against Napoleon. And yesterday there was some thunder here. I don't think you guys could hear it on the video. And today there might be a little bit of it as well, but it really helps set the mood, at least for my end, and I wish I could have captured it, but of like the beginning of a battle, and they're talking about the fog rolling in and the troops descending into the valley, into the fog, and not being able to see anything, and the crackle of gunfire, and this sort of tense and the anticipation. And the Russians, they're thinking they have the French on the run. They think all the rest of the French troops are far away, only to find out as the next battalion heads down, most of the French troops are right there. They're rushing up to them. They go to Bonaparte, and you see him waiting for and seeing the Russian movements, and knowing that the Russians and the Austrians have underestimated where he is and what he's doing, and that it's actually the day of the battle is actually the anniversary of his coronation, and he waits for this moment. And as the sun breaks over the fog, he sends his troops into battle, and they are running up the hill to meet the Russian troops. Caught them by surprise. They're going to take over the battery, and one of our main characters, Andrei Bolkonsky, Prince Andrei, sees this as his moment to make his mark, and he's going to grab the standard of the Russian army that's falling. And as he does see someone who is carrying their standard fall, he jumps and grabs it and runs in, and he's going to lead the charge. And all these soldiers are fleeing, and he's going to get them to rally, and he wants them to run and help the battery and the artillerists to keep them from taking over the cannon. There's some thunder, and it's exciting, and then he's watching these two soldiers fight over this cannon, and is he going to make it before, they start firing again at him? And is the Russian going to get the control of the cannon back or not? And then just then he gets hit, and he falls to the ground, and he just sees like the sky, and is suddenly like at peace as he's like, I'm assuming, going unconscious. And so that's where we leave it. So we have no idea if the Russians are going to be able to turn around. There's been a lot of running by the Russian army so far. No offense to all my Russian friends. The Russian army has, throughout history, been seen as a fearsome force, and is often, been proven, especially on their own turf, quite indefatigable and just unstoppable. But it's interesting that throughout some of these battles with Napoleon, there's a lot of, I guess it's what you hear a lot in war, is that it's a lot more chaos and a lot more like, yeah, we're going to run, and there's all this bravado and people are ready. And then the minute the gunfire starts, or the minute this group is caught unaware, there's just chaos and running. So that's where there's been a lot of that so far. And we will see how that will play out. Hopefully we'll see today, because we're going to dive right back in and see what happened to poor Andrei Bolkonsky, who is one of my more favorite characters, I would say. He seems to be a man of a bit more character than maybe some of the others, though there is still a bit of this pride in him and this desire to prove himself through this battle and through the fighting, and to make a name for himself, which, I mean, I think everyone wants, but it is a bit of like this ego and pride in him and where he comes from. And his father being a very exact man of standing and man of principles. So they definitely have descended a bit into him through that exchange from his father. One other thing, funny thing that I remembered was just that the thing about him always having this vision of carrying the standard which I can see it as like this noble idea of like when the troops are falling back and when there's chaos and disorder, you want to be the one to grab the flag and lead the charge again. You know, it's kind of like that iconic picture you see a lot on Memorial Day from Iwo Jima with the soldiers riding the American flag in World War II. And I feel like there's a lot of that imagery that even would have predated that imagery actually, but in his mind of like carrying the flag for his flag forward. But the funny thing was when he actually did get this, he could barely hold it because the pole and stuff itself was so heavy. And clearly he was not a man who gymmed a lot, I'm guessing. So there's a funny side note. But again, welcome to my watchers who have been here before, my new subscribers. Welcome. Thank you for finding us, and I hope this is beneficial to you. I do have the full playlist up, so you can scroll back to the beginning, catch up on any of the storyline that you miss, or if anything seemed unclear, flip back through. And I hope you will find it as interesting as I have. So without further ado, let's get into it. We are, like I said, we're in Volume 1, Part 3, Section 17. And this is still in the morning of the battle. At 9 o'clock, the action had not yet begun for Bagration on the right flank. Not wishing to agree to Dolgorukov's request to begin action and wishing to avert responsibility from himself, Prince Bagration suggested to Dolgorukov that he send to ask the commander-in-chief. Bagration knew that, with a stretch of nearly 6 miles separating one flank from the other, if the messenger was not killed, which was very probable, and even if he found the commander-in-chief, which would be quite difficult, he would not come back before evening. Bagration looked over his suite with his big, expressionless, sleepy eyes, and Rostov's childlike face, involuntarily fixated with excitement and hope, was the first thing that struck his eye. He sent him. "And if I should meet His Majesty before the Commander-in-Chief, Your Excellency?" asked Rostov, holding his hand to his visor. "You can give the message to His Majesty," said Dolgorukov, hastily cutting off Bagration. After being relieved from the picket line, Rostov had managed to sleep for a few hours before morning, and he felt cheerful, bold, resolute, with that suppleness of movement, assuredness of his good luck, and in the state of mind in which everything seemed easy, cheerful, and possible. All his wishes were being fulfilled that morning. General battle was to be given. He was to take part in it. Moreover, he was an orderly officer of the bravest of generals. Moreover, he was going with a message to Kutuzov and maybe to the sovereign himself. The morning was bright. The horse under him was good. He felt joyful and happy. On receiving the order, he started his horse and rode along the line. First, he rode along the line of Bagration's troops, who had not yet gone into action and stood motionless. Then he rode into the space occupied by Uvarov's cavalry, and here he noticed the movement and signs of preparation for action. Having passed Uvarov's cavalry, he clearly heard the sounds of cannon and gunfire ahead of him. The fire kept intensifying. In the fresh morning air, the shooting was no longer as before, at irregular intervals, 2 or 3 gunshots, then 1 or 2 cannon shots. Now on the slopes of the hills before Prats, one could hear the rolling salvos of musket fire, interrupted by such rapid cannon fire that at times the separate shots could not be distinguished from each other, but merged into a general roar. One could see the puffs of gun smoke as if running and chasing each other on the slopes, the smoke of the cannon swirling, spreading, and merging together. One could see, from the gleam of bayonets amidst the smoke, the moving masses of infantry and the narrow strips of artillery with green caissons. Rostov stopped his horse for a minute on a knoll so as to see what was going on, but no matter how he strained his attention, he could neither understand nor make out what was going on. Some sort of men were moving about in the smoke. Some sort of sheets of troops were moving in front and behind. But why? Who? Where? It was impossible to grasp. The sights and sounds not only did not arouse any sort of dejected or timid feelings in him, but on the contrary gave him energy and determination. More, step it up! He addressed these sounds mentally and again started moving along the line, penetrating further and further into the area of the troops already going into action. How is it going to be? I don't know, but all will be well, thought Rostov. Having ridden past some Austrian troops, Rostov noticed that the next part of the line, this was the Guards, had already gone into action. So much the better. I'll see it close up, he thought. He was riding almost along the front line. Several horsemen came riding in his direction. They were our life Uhlans, who were returning from an attack in disorderly ranks. Rostov passed by them, involuntarily noticing that one of them was covered with blood, and rode on. It's none of my business, he thought. He had not managed to go a few hundred paces after that when to the left of him, cutting across, there appeared along the whole width of the field an enormous mass of cavalrymen on black horses in white gleaming uniforms coming straight at him at a canter. Rostov sent his horse into a full gallop to get out of the way of these cavalrymen, and he would have gotten away from them if they had continued at the same speed. But they kept increasing their pace, so that some of the horses were already galloping. Rostov heard their hoofbeats and the clanging of their weapons growing louder and louder, and saw their horses, their figures, even their faces more clearly. These were our guard horses going into attack against the French cavalry which was coming towards them. The horse guards galloped, but still holding back their horses. Rostov could now see their faces and heard the command, "Forward! Forward!" uttered by an officer, letting his thoroughbred go at full speed. Rostov, afraid of being trampled or swept into the attack on the French, galloped along the front as hard as his horse could go, and still did not manage to avoid them. The last horse guard, a pockmarked man of enormous height, frowned angrily, seeing Rostov in front of him, where he would inevitably run into him. His horse guard would certainly have knocked Rostov and his Bedouin down. Rostov felt himself so small and weak compared to these enormous men and horses. If it had not occurred to him to swing his whip to the eyes of the guardsman's horse, the heavy black 20-hand horse shied, laying back his ears. But the pockmarked horse guard spurred him as hard as he could with his huge spurs, and the horse, tossing his tail and stretching his neck, raced on still faster. The horse guards had barely gone past Rostov when he heard their shout of "Hurrah!" and turning saw their front ranks mingling with other, probably French, horsemen with red epaulets. Beyond that, nothing could be seen, because just after that, cannon began firing from somewhere, and everything was covered in smoke. At the moment when the horse guards, going past him, disappeared into the smoke, Rostov hesitated whether to gallop after them or ride where he was supposed to. This was the brilliant attack of the horse guards which astonished the French themselves. Rostov was horrified to hear later that, of all that mass of enormous handsome men, of all those brilliant rich men, youths, officers, and junkers who had ridden past him on 1,000-ruble horses, only 18 were left after the attack. Why should I envy them? Mine won't go away, and maybe I'll see the sovereign, thought Rostov, and he rode on. Having drawn even with the infantry guards, he noticed that cannonballs were flying over and around them, not so much because he heard the sound of the cannon, but because he saw uneasiness on the soldiers' faces and on the officers, and unnatural military solemnity. Riding behind one of the lines of the infantry guard regiments, he heard a voice call him by name. "Rostov!" "What?" he replied, not recognizing Boris. "Imagine we got into the front line. Our regiment went into attack," said Boris, smiling that happy smile which occurs in young men who have been under fire for the first time. Rostov stopped. "Really?" he said. "And what then?" "We beat them back," Boris said animatedly, becoming talkative. "Can you imagine?" And Boris began telling how the guards, taking up their position and seeing troops in front of them, took them for Austrians, and suddenly, from the cannonballs fired from those troops, realized that they were in the front line and had unexpectedly to go into action. Rostov, not hearing Boris out, touched up his horse. "Where are you going?" asked Boris. "To His Majesty, with a message." "There he is," said Boris, who thought he heard Rostov say His Highness instead of His Majesty. And he pointed him to the Grand Duke, who, 100 paces from them, in a helmet and a horse guard's tunic, with his raised shoulders and frowning brows, was shouting something to a white and pale-faced Austrian officer. "But that's the Grand Duke, and I need the commander-in-chief or the sovereign," said Rostov, and he touched up his horse. "Count, Count!" cried Berg, as animated as Boris, running up to him from the other side. "Count, I'm wounded in the right hand," he said, showing his hand, bloody and bandaged with a handkerchief. "And I stayed in the line. I hold the sword in my left hand. Count, our race, the von Bergs. Count, we're all knights." Berg was still saying something, but Rostov did not listen any further and rode on. Having gone past the guards and an empty space, Rostov, to avoid getting into the front line again, as he had during the attack of the horse guards, followed the line of the reserves, making a wide circle around the place where the hottest shooting and cannon fire was heard. Suddenly ahead of him and behind him And behind our troops, in a place where he could never have supposed the enemy to be, he heard nearby musket fire. What can that be? Thought Rostov. The enemy in rear of our troops? It can't be, thought Rostov, and the terror of fear for himself and for the outcome of the whole battle suddenly came over him. Whatever it may be, however, he thought, there's no point now in going around. I must look for the commander-in-chief here, and if all is lost, then it's my business to perish along with everybody. The bad presentiment that suddenly came over Rostov was confirmed more and more the further he rode into the space beyond the village of Prats, occupied by crowds of different troops. What is this? What is this? Who's being shot at? Who's shooting? Asked Rostov, drawing even with Russian and Austrian soldiers running in mixed crowds across his path. Devil knows about them. He's beaten everybody. Perish them all, came answers in Russian, German, and Czech from the crowds of fleeing men who, like himself, did not understand what was going on there. Shoot the Germans, cried one. Devil take them, the traitors. Zum Henker dies Russen, a German growled, to the devil with these Russians. Several wounded soldiers were walking down the road. Oaths, shouts, groans merged into one general clamor. The shooting had died down, and as Rostov learned later, it had been Russian and Austrian soldiers shooting at each other. My God, what is it? Thought Rostov. Here, where the sovereign may see them at any moment. But no, it must be just a few scoundrels. It will pass. That's not it. It can't be, he thought. Just ride past them quickly, quickly. The thought of defeat and flight could not enter Rostov's head, though he saw French guns and troops precisely on the Ponzin Heights, in the very place where he had been told to look for the commander-in-chief. He could not and would not believe it. Section 18. Rostov had been told to look for Kutuzov and the sovereign near the village of Prats. But not only were they not there, but there was not a single superior officer. There were only various crowds of disorderly troops. He urged on his already tired horse so as to get quickly past the crowds, but the further he went, the more disorderly the crowds became. The high road he came out on was crowded with carriages, vehicles of all kinds, Russian and Austrian soldiers of all arms, wounded and not wounded. All this droned and swarmed confusedly under the grim sound of cannonballs flying from the French batteries set up on the Pratzen Heights. Where is the sovereign? Where is Kutuzov? Rostov asked everyone he could stop, and he got no answer from any of them. At last, seizing a soldier by the collar, he made him answer. Ah, brother, they all ran off there long ago, the soldier said to Rostov, laughing at something and trying to free himself. Abandoning that soldier, who was obviously drunk, Rostov stopped the horse of an orderly or groom of some important person and began questioning him. The orderly announced to Rostov that the sovereign had been driven away at top speed in a carriage an hour earlier and that he was dangerously wounded. It can't be, said Rostov. It must have been somebody else. I saw him myself, said the orderly with a self-assured grin. I ought to know the sovereign by now. Seems I saw him lots of times in Petersburg, this close. He was sitting in the carriage, pale as can be. 4 black horses. Saints alive, how they went rattling past us. Seems I ought to know the Tsar's horses and Ilya Ivanitch's by now. Seems Ilya the coachman drives nobody but the Tsar. Rostov let go of his horse and wanted to ride on. Passing by, a wounded officer addressed him. Who do you want? asked the officer. The commander-in-chief? He was killed by a cannonball, hit in the chest in front of our regiment. Not killed, wounded, another officer corrected. Who? Kutuzov? Asked Rostov. Not Kutuzov, but what's his name? Well, it makes no difference. There weren't many left alive. Go over there to that village. All the superiors are assembled there, said this officer, pointing to the village of Hostiradak, and he passed by. Rostov rode at a walk, not knowing why, and to whom he was going now. The sovereign was wounded. The battle was lost. It was impossible not to believe it now. Rostov rode in the direction indicated to him, in which he could see a tower and a church in the distance. Why should he hurry? What was he to say now to the sovereign or to Kutuzov, even if they were alive and not wounded? Go that way, your honor. Here you'll get killed straight off, a soldier cried to him. Killed straight off. Ah, what are you saying, said another. Where are you sending him? This way's closer. Rostov pondered and went precisely in the direction in which he was told he would be killed. It makes no difference now. If even the sovereign is wounded, why should I look out for myself, he thought. He rode into that space in which the most men fleeing from Prats had been killed. The French had not yet taken this space, but the Russians, those who were alive or wounded, had abandoned it long ago. Over the field, like sheaves on a good wheat land, lay dead or wounded men, 10 to 15 to an acre. The wounded crept together by twos and threes, and one could hear their unpleasant cries and moans. Sometimes feigned, as it seemed to Rostov. He set his horse into a canter, so as not to see all these suffering men, and he felt frightened. He was afraid not for his life, but for the courage he needed, and which he knew could not bear the sight of these wretches. The French, who had stopped firing on this field strewn with dead and wounded because there was nothing left alive on it, seeing an adjutant riding across it, aimed a cannon and fired several shots. The sensation of these whistling, fearsome sounds and the surrounding dead merged for Rostov into a single impression of terror and pity for himself. He recalled his mother's last letter. What would she feel, he wondered, if she saw me here now, on this field with cannon aimed at me? In the village of Hostirodek, he found the Russian troops, confused, but heading away from the battlefield in greater order. The French cannon fire did not carry that far, and the sounds of shooting seemed a long way off. Here everyone already clearly saw and said that the battle was lost. No matter who Rostov turned to, no one could tell him where the sovereign was or where Kutuzov was. Some said that the rumor of the sovereign's wound was correct, others said it was not, and explained the spread of this false rumor by the fact that the Grand Marshal of the court, Count Tolstoy, who had ridden to the battlefield with others in the emperor's suite, had indeed galloped away from the battlefield, pale and frightened, in the sovereign's carriage. One officer told Rostov that he had seen someone from high command to the left beyond the village, and Rostov went there, no longer hoping to find anyone, but only to keep his own conscience clear. Having ridden 2 miles and left behind the last of the Russian troops, Rostov saw 2 horsemen standing near a kitchen garden surrounded by a ditch. They were facing this ditch. One, with white plumes on his hat, seemed familiar to Rostov for some reason. The other, an unfamiliar horseman on a beautiful chestnut horse, the horse seemed familiar to Rostov, rode up to the ditch, spurred his horse, and releasing the reins, lightly jumped over the garden ditch. Only a little soil crumbled down the bank from the horse's hind hooves. Turning his horse sharply, he leaped back over the ditch and courteously addressed the horseman with the white plumes, evidently suggesting that he do the same. The horseman, whose figure seemed familiar to Rostov and for some reason involuntarily riveted his attention, made a negative gesture with his head in his hand, and by this gesture Rostov instantly recognized his lamented, adored sovereign. But that can't be him, alone in the middle of this empty field, thought Rostov. Just then Alexander turned his head, and Rostov saw the beloved features so vividly imprinted on his memory. The sovereign was pale, his cheeks were hollow, his eyes sunken. But there was all the loveliness and mildness in his features. Rostov was happy now to be assured that the rumor of the sovereign's wound was incorrect. He was happy to see him, happy he knew that he could, even must, address him directly and convey to him what Dolgorukov had ordered him to convey. But as a young man in love trembles and thrills, not daring to utter what he dreams of by night, and looks around fearfully, seeking help or the possibility of delay or flight, when the desired moment comes and he stands alone with her, so now Rostov, having attained what he desired more than anything in the world, did not know how to approach the sovereign and presented thousands of considerations to himself for why it was unsuitable, improper, and impossible. What? It's as if I was glad to take advantages of his being alone and dejected. It may be unpleasant and difficult for him to meet an unknown person at this moment of sorrow. And then what can I say to him now, when at the mere sight of him my heart stops and my mouth goes dry? None of the countless speeches to the sovereign that he had composed in his imagination came to his head now. Those speeches were for the most part held under quite different conditions. They were spoken for the most part in moments of victory and triumph, and predominantly on his deathbed from the wounds he had received when the sovereign thanked him for his heroic deeds, and he, dying, voiced the love confirmed by his acts. And then, what am I to ask the sovereign about his orders for the right flank when it is now past 3 in the afternoon and the battle is lost? No, decidedly I should not approach him, should not bother his thoughts. Better to die 1,000 times than to get a bad look or a bad opinion from him. Rostov decided and rode away with sorrow and despair in his heart, constantly turning to look at the sovereign, still standing in the same attitude of indecision. While Rostov was making these considerations and sorrowfully riding away from the sovereign, Captain von Toll happened to arrive at the same place, and seeing the sovereign, rode straight up to him, offered him his services, and helped him to cross the ditch on foot. The sovereign, wishing to rest and feeling unwell, sat down under an apple tree, and Toll stopped beside him. Rostov, from a distance, with envy and regret, saw Von Toll say something to the sovereign at length and with ardor, and saw the sovereign, probably weeping, cover his eyes with his hand and press Toll's hand. Ah, I could be in his place, Rostov thought to himself, and barely holding back tears of pity over the sovereign's fate, rode on in complete despair, not knowing where he was going or why. His despair was stronger in that he felt his own weaknesses was the cause of his grief. He not only could, but should have ridden up to the sovereign, and that was a unique chance to show the sovereign his devotion, and he had not made use of it. What have I done? He thought, and he turned his horse and rode back to the place where he had seen the sovereign, but there was no one now on the other side of the ditch. Only wagons and carriages drove along. From one cart driver he learned that Kutuzov's staff was in a nearby village where the train was going. Rostov followed them. Ahead of him walked Kutuzov's groom, leading horses covered with cloths. Behind the groom came a wagon, and behind the wagon an old house serf in a peaked cap, a short coat, and with bandy legs. Titus, hey Titus, said the groom. What? The old man asked distractedly. Titus, don't bite us. Ah, you fool. Pah, the old man said and spat angrily. Some time passed in silent movement, and the same joke was repeated again. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the battle had been lost at all points. More than 100 cannon had already been captured by the French. Zerbaiszuski and his corps laid down their arms. Other columns, having lost about half their men, were retreating in disorderly, confused crowds. The remains of Langron's and Doktorov's troops, mixed together, crowded the dams and banks of the ponds near the village of Augisid. After 5 o'clock, it was not only at the dam of Augisid that the hot cannon fire of the French alone could be heard, from the numerous batteries lined up on the slopes of the Pratzen heights and firing at our retreating troops. In the rear guard, Doktorov and others, drawing up some battalions, fired back at the French cavalry who were pursuing our troops. It was beginning to get dark. On the narrow dam of Augisid, on which for so many years an old miller in a cap used to sit peacefully with his fishing rods, while his grandson, his shirt sleeves rolled up, fingered the silvery, trembling fish in the watering can. On this dam, over which for so many years Moravians in shaggy hats and blue jackets had peacefully driven in their 2-horse carts laden with wheat, and had driven back over the same dam, all dusty with flour, their carts white. Now in this narrow dam, between wagons and cannon, under horses and between wheels, crowded men disfigured by the fear of death, crushing each other, dying, stepping over the dying, killing each other, only to go a few steps and be killed themselves just the same. Every 10 seconds, pushing through the air, a cannonball smacked or a shell exploded in the midst of this dense crowd, killing and spattering with blood those who stood near. Dolokhov, wounded in the arm, on foot with a dozen soldiers of his company, he was already an officer, and his regimental commander, on horseback, represented the remainder of the entire regiment. Drawn by the crowd, they pressed into the entrance to the dam, and hemmed in on all sides, stopped because ahead of them a horse had fallen under a cannon, and the crowd was pulling it out. One cannonball killed someone behind them, another landed in front and splattered Dolokhov with blood. The crowd pushed on desperately, shrank back, went a few steps, and stopped again. Get through these 100 steps and I'm safe for sure. Stand here another 2 minutes and I'm sure to be dead, each man was thinking. Dolokhov, who was standing in the middle of the crowd, tore his way to the edge of the dam, knocking 2 soldiers off their feet, and ran down onto the slippery ice that covered the pond. Turn off, he cried, skipping over the ice which cracked under him. Turn off, he cried to the ordnance. It holds. The ice held him, but it sagged and cracked, and it was obvious that it would give way, not only under a cannon or a crowd, but under him alone. People looked at him and pressed to the bank, not yet daring to step onto the ice. The regimental commander, standing on horseback at the entrance, raised his arm and opened his mouth, addressing Dolokhov. Suddenly, one of the cannonballs came whistling so low over the crowd that everyone ducked. There was a wet smack, and the general and his horse fell in a pool of blood. No one looked at the general, still less thought of picking him up. Go on to the ice! Go on to the ice! Go! Turn off! Don't you hear? Go! Cried countless voices after the cannonball hit the general. themselves not knowing what and why they were shouting. One of the rearmost cannon going on to the dam turned off onto the ice. Crowds of soldiers started running down off the dam onto the frozen pond. The ice cracked under one of the foremost soldiers, and one foot went into the water. He tried to right himself and fell through to the waist. The nearest soldiers hesitated. The cannon driver stopped his horse, but shouts were still heard from behind. "Go onto the ice! Don't stop! Go! Go!" And cries of terror were heard in the crowd. The soldiers around the gun waved at the horses and beat them to make them turn and move on. The horses set out from the bank. The ice that had held the foot soldiers gave way in one huge piece, and about 40 of them rushed, some back, some forward, drowning each other. The cannonballs went on regularly whistling and smacking into the ice, into the water, and most often into the crowds that covered the dam, the ponds, and the bank. Section 19. On the Pratzen Hill, in the same place where he had fell from the staff of the standard, had fell with the staff of the standard in his hands, Prince Andrei Bolkonsky lay bleeding profusely, and unbeknownst to himself, letting out soft, pitiful, and childlike moans. Towards evening he stopped moaning and became completely still. He did not know how long he was unconscious. Suddenly he felt himself alive again and suffering from a burning and rending pain in the head. Where is it, that lofty sky which I never knew till now and saw today, was his first thought. And I never knew this suffering either, he thought. Yes, I knew nothing till now. But where am I? He began to listen and heard the sounds of approaching hoofbeats and the sounds of voices speaking French. He opened his eyes. Over him again was the same lofty sky with floating clouds rising still higher, through which showed the blue of infinity. He did not turn his head and did not see those who, judging by the sounds of hoofs and voices, had ridden up to him and stopped. The horsemen who had ridden up were Napoleon, accompanied by 2 adjutants. Bonaparte, riding over the battlefield, had given final orders about the reinforcements of the batteries firing at the dam of Augesed, and was looking at the dead and wounded who were left on the battlefield. "De Buchons," said Napoleon, looking at a dead Russian grenadier who, his face buried in the ground and his nape blackened, lay on his stomach, one of his already stiff arms flung far out. "Les munitions des pieces de position sont épuisées, sire," an adjutant said just then, having come from the batteries that were firing on Augesed. "Faites aventure celles de la réserve," said Napoleon, and riding on a few paces, he stepped over Prince Andrei, who lay on his back, the staff of the standard fallen beside him. The standard had already been taken as a trophy by the French. "Voilà une belle bonte," said Napoleon, looking at Bolkonsky. Prince Andrei understood that it had been said about him, and that it was Napoleon speaking. He heard the man who said these words being addressed as "Sire," and he heard these words as if he were hearing the buzzing of a fly. He not only was not interested, he did not even notice, and at once forgot them. He had a burning in his head. He felt like he was losing blood, and he saw above him that distant, lofty, and eternal sky. He knew that it was Napoleon, his hero, but at that moment, Napoleon seemed to him such a small, insignificant man compared with what was now happening between his soul and this lofty, infinite sky, with clouds racing across it. To him, it was all completely the same at the moment who was standing over him or what he said about him. He was only glad that people had stopped over him, and only wished that those people who would help him and bring him back to life, which seemed so beautiful to him, because he now understood it so differently. He gathered all his strength in order to stir and produce some sound. He stirred his leg weakly and produced a weak, pitiful moan that moved even him to pity. "Ah, he's alive," said Napoleon. "Lift up this young man, Sir Yon-hung, and take him to the first aid station." Having said that, Napoleon rode on further to meet Marshal Lannes, who was riding up to the emperor, taking off his hat and congratulating him on the victory. Prince Andrei remembered nothing more. He lost consciousness from the terrible pain of being put on a stretcher, the jolting while he was being carried, and the probing of his wound at the first aid station. He came to only at the end of the day, when he, along with the other Russian wounded and captured officers, was taken to the hospital. During this transfer, he felt somewhat fresher and could look around and even speak. The first words he heard when he came to were the words of the French convoy officer, who was saying hurriedly, "We must stop here. The Emperor will ride by now. It will give him pleasure to see all these gentlemen prisoners." "There are so many prisoners today, almost the whole Russian army, that he must be bored with it," said another officer. "Well, really, this is, they say, the commander of all the Emperor Alexander's guards," said the first, pointing to a wounded Russian officer in the white uniform of the horse guards. Bolkonsky recognized Prince Repnin, whom he used to meet in Petersburg society. Next to him stood another wounded officer of the horse guards, a 19-year-old boy. Bonaparte, riding up at a gallop, stopped his horse. "Who's the senior man?" They named the colonel, Prince Repnin. "Are you the commander of Emperor Alexander's regiment of horse guards?" asked Napoleon. "I command a squadron," replied Repnin. "Your regiment fulfilled its duty honorably," said Napoleon. "The praise of a great general is a soldier's best reward," said Repnin. "I bestow it on you with pleasure," said Napoleon. "Who is this young man next to you?" Prince Repnin named Lieutenant Suktelin. Napoleon looked at him and said something. "Il est venu bien jeune se frotter à nous." "Youth is no impediment to bravery," Suktelin said in a halting voice. "A fine answer," said Napoleon. "You'll go far, young man." Prince Andrei, who, to complete the trophy of prisoners, was also brought out before the eyes of the emperor, could not fail to attract his attention. Napoleon evidently remembered seeing him on the battlefield, and turning to him, used the same appellation of a young man, jeune homme, under which Bolkonsky had been imprinted on his memory the first time. "Et vous, jeune homme, and you, young man," he addressed him. "How do you feel, mon brave?" Though 5 minutes earlier Prince Andrei had been able to say a few words to the soldiers transporting him, now, with his eyes fixed directly on Napoleon, he was silent. To him, at that moment, all the interest that occupied Napoleon seemed so insignificant. His hero himself seemed so petty to him, with his petty vanity and joy in victory, compared with that lofty, just, and kindly sky, which he had seen and understood, that he was unable to answer him. Then, too, everything seemed so useless and insignificant compared with that stern and majestic way of thinking, called up in him by weakness from loss of blood, suffering, and the expectation of imminent death. Looking into Napoleon's eyes, Prince Andrei thought about the insignificance of grandeur, about the insignificance of life, the meaning of which no one could understand, and about the still greater insignificance of death, the meaning of which no one among the living could understand or explain. The emperor, receiving no answer, turned away, and, as he rode off, addressed one of the officers. "Have these gentlemen looked after and taken to my bivouac. Have my Dr. Loche examine their wounds. Goodbye, Prince Repnin," and touching up his horse, he galloped on. On his face was the radiance of self-satisfaction and happiness. The soldiers who had carried Prince Andrei and taken him from the little gold icon, and had taken from him the little golden icon hung on her brother by Princess Maria, seeing the kindness with which the emperor treated the prisoners, hastened to return the icon. Prince Andrei did not see how or by whom it was put back on him, but suddenly on his chest over the uniform, a little gold icon and a fine gold chain turned up. It would be good, thought Prince Andrei, looking at this icon, which his sister had hung on him with such feeling and reverence. It would be good if everything was as clear and simple as it seemed to Princess Maria. How good it would be to know where to look for help in this life, and what to expect after it, there beyond the grave. How happy and calm I'd be if I could now say, "Lord, have mercy on me." But to whom shall I say it? Either it is an indefinable, unfathomable power which I not only cannot address, but which I cannot express in words, the great all or nothing, he said to himself. Or it is that God whom Princess Maria has sewn in here, in this amulet. Nothing is certain except the insignificance of everything I can comprehend, and the grandeur of something incomprehensible, but most important. The stretchers began to move. At every jolt he felt unbearable pain. His feverish state worsened and he became delirious. Those reveries of his father, wife, sister, and future son, and the tenderness he had experienced on the night before the battle, the figure of the little insignificant Napoleon, and the lofty sky over it all, constituted the main basis for his feverish imaginings. He imagined a quiet life and peaceful family happiness at Bald Hills. He was already enjoying this happiness when suddenly little Napoleon appeared with his indifferent, limited gaze, happy in the unhappiness of others, and doubts and torments set in, and only the sky promised tranquility. Towards morning, all his reveries became confused and merged into the chaos and darkness of unconsciousness and oblivion, which, in the opinion of Lohe himself, Napoleon's doctor, would most likely end in death rather than recovery. C'est son sujet nerveux et bilieux, c'est Lohe. Il n'en réchappera pas. He's the nervous and bilious sort. He won't pull through. Prince Andrei, among other hopeless wounded, was handed over to the care of the local inhabitants. And that's the end of Volume 1. Yay! So, there you have it. And the battle, which we thought would probably not go well, did not go well. And maybe this is the end of Prince Andrei. We shall see. Well, if you guys have any thoughts or questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Like I said, I always have, I've said previously, I always have the live chat going, so feel free to drop any comments or questions during the reading or afterwards, and I will try to respond as quickly as possible. Quite an exciting turn of events, and also not exciting in the sense that it was a bit anticlimactic for the Russian troops, though anticlimactic might be an understatement. So everyone kind of got to see their idol in this last reading. Prince Andrei saw Napoleon, and Rostov saw the Emperor, and both kind of came away disappointed, either in themselves or in the exchange. Neither really had the impression that they wanted to have. Prince Andrei, being sick, didn't really bother to say or try to say anything to Napoleon, and came away not feeling that impressed with him. And Rostov, in the midst of that strange situation, felt like he shouldn't say anything to the Emperor and then kicked himself for not doing it. So kind of interesting dichotomy there. But, I mean, I guess that happens a lot when we come against those we idolize or those we look up to. We rarely come away with the impression that we want. All right. Well, we'll begin Volume 2 tomorrow. And like I said, that takes us almost into the end of the first quarter of the book. So, yay, we're making it through. Still a long way to go, though. So thank you guys. Hold on tight, and I'll see you all tomorrow. Have a great day. Stay safe and healthy.